The night after the cameras were gone, the house did not grow quieter. It grew heavier, the kind of weight that presses on the chest, even when no one is speaking. For decades, the world had known Rob Reiner as a symbol of warmth and human decency, a man whose films taught millions to believe in love, friendship, and gentle endings. Yet inside that carefully protected private space, the reality unfolding after his death was nothing like the image that had lived on screens and red carpets. What remained was not applause, not legacy speeches, but a family sitting in silence, surrounded by memories that suddenly felt too loud to bear. The funeral was immaculate. The lighting was perfect. Familiar faces from Hollywood arrived one after another, offering practice condolences, embracing just long enough for the cameras to capture grief without intrusion. From the outside, it looked like a dignified farewell to a beloved figure. Inside, however, something far more unsettling was taking shape. A daughter stood beside the coffin, listening to words about greatness and kindness, while carrying a truth that did not fit any of those sentences. She understood in that moment that mourning was not only about losing a father. It was about confronting the man no one else had ever been allowed to see. She would later say that the Rob Reiner admired by the world was not the same man who lived inside their home. Not a monster, not a villain, but a presence shaped by anger, control, and fear, all sharpened by the pressure of fame. His love existed, but it arrived wrapped in conditions, expectations, and rules that left no room for weakness. From an early age, the children learned that ordinary was not an option. Every word, every choice, every misstep was measured against a last name that carried enormous weight. Childhood did not feel like discovery. It felt like rehearsal. Behind closed doors, conversations stretched late into the night, not because of warmth, but because silence was dangerous. Silence meant disappointment was building. Silence meant judgment had not yet been spoken. Even small mistakes landed with an intensity that made them feel unforgivable. Love in that house was not something freely given. It was something earned, then constantly re-earned through achievement and obedience. Failure did not simply hurt. It threatened belonging. What made the situation even more confusing was that none of this was visible to the outside world. Publicly, the family appeared flawless. Smiles were timed perfectly. Affection was displayed when expected. Interviews followed a familiar script about gratitude and unity. The contrast between the public image and private reality created a fracture that grew wider with each passing year. The children learned to switch versions of themselves depending on where they were standing. In front of cameras, confidence. At home, vigilance. As the years passed, the pressure did not ease. It concentrated. Creative stress followed their father home from film sets. Reviews clung to him like shadows, and anxieties he never voiced spilled into the household in unpredictable ways. A dropped spoon could provoke irritation. A careless comment could ignite an outburst. The house was large, beautiful, and materially complete, yet emotionally cramped. There was space to walk, but no space to exhale. The most devastating part was that love never disappeared. It became distorted. Moments of tenderness appeared just often enough to keep hope alive. On rare days when work went well and praise flowed in, he could be gentle, even proud. Those moments hurt the most because they proved what was possible, then vanished. The children loved him deeply, even as they learned to fear his reactions. They wanted his approval, his smile, his relief. They also carried resentment they did not know how to name. After his death, that contradiction became impossible to ignore. Grief opened doors that had remained sealed for years. Memories surfaced that no longer asked permission. A daughter began to speak, not to destroy a legacy, but to breathe after decades of restraint. She described a family slowly eroded by expectations, by unspoken pain, by the belief that strength meant silence. She did not call her father a demon. She did not crown him a hero. She described him as a man shaped by an aura he never learned to escape. What makes this story so unsettling is not a single shocking act, but the accumulation of countless small moments that passed without repair. The tragedy did not arrive suddenly. It approached quietly, day by day, hidden behind success, talent, and applause. Fame did not strike like lightning. It lingered like a shadow, long enough to cover an entire household. Standing beside that coffin, the daughter understood something that would haunt her long after the funeral ended. The most frightening part was not what happened in the end, but how clearly she had seen it coming and how powerless she had felt to stop it. The world would remember a legend. She would remember a family that broke without ever making a sound. In the public eye, Rob Reiner was a figure of stability and success, a legendary filmmaker whose work had the power to touch hearts and stir emotions. His films, including The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men, painted a picture of a man who understood love, friendship, and justice. However, behind the scenes, the reality was far more complicated. Romy, his daughter, shared that growing up in the shadow of her father was both a blessing and a burden. The family, seemingly perfect on the outside, carried hidden fractures that only those closest to Rob knew about. Raised in the glare of Hollywood's limelight, Romy and her brother often found themselves performing a role far removed from their true selves. The pressure to uphold their father's legacy was a constant force in their lives. It wasn't just about achieving great things. It was about maintaining an image of perfection that was unshakable in the eyes of the public. Romy described the heavy weight of growing up under Rob's watchful eye, where nothing was ever good enough. It wasn't just about academic or professional achievement. It was about maintaining the image of a perfect family. Every decision, from their schooling to their social circles, was influenced by the family status. The choices weren't made for their individual growth or happiness. Instead, they were made to preserve the family's public reputation. From a young age, Romy was told that she wasn't just a child. She was the heir to a legacy. She and her brother were expected to continue what their father had started, to live lives worthy of the name Reiner. The idea of personal choice or individual desires seemed almost foreign. Even the simplest aspects of daily life, like where they went to school or who they associated with, were dictated by the family's needs. Romy reflected on how every small detail of her life was controlled. The relationships she had with friends were carefully curated by her father, who sought to surround his children with the right people. Even their personal expression, how they spoke, how they smiled, how they behaved in public, was scrutinized and edited by Rob. Romy felt like a character in a film, playing a role designed by someone else. She was constantly being reminded that she wasn't just living for herself, she was living for the family's image. But the public didn't see the cracks beneath the surface. While the world admired the Reiner family for their perfect smiles on red carpets and their words of tribute in interviews, behind closed doors, there was a different story. Romy's memories of family life were filled with moments of tension and unspoken sorrow. Her father's outbursts of anger, his perfectionism, and his expectations weighed heavily on her, and the love that was supposed to bind them together often felt conditional. The scars from those years didn't just come from Rob's anger, though. They came from the emotional toll of constantly striving to meet expectations that felt impossible to live up to. Romy and her brother were expected to be flawless, to represent the Reiner name with dignity and honor. Any failure, no matter how small, was seen as a personal betrayal, an act that would tarnish the family's carefully cultivated image. In those moments of failure, Romy was filled with an overwhelming sense of guilt. She didn't just feel the sadness of letting her father down. She felt as if she was failing to live up to an ideal that wasn't even her own. It wasn't enough to simply be good enough for herself. It was about meeting the standards set by her father, which always seemed just beyond reach. As she grew older, Romy began to see the world differently. She realized that the love she had been seeking all her life was not the kind of love she truly needed. She longed for a connection that wasn't tied to her achievements or to the family name. But no matter how much she tried to break free from the constraints of her father's expectations, They continued to haunt her, shaping her sense of self and her relationships. Romy's relationship with her father was complex, a mix of love, resentment, and a deep longing for something that felt real and unfiltered. The story of Rob's family was not one of perfect harmony, but of people trying to meet impossible standards while simultaneously grappling with their own fears, insecurities, and desires. But beyond the external pressures, there was also a sense of internal conflict within Rob himself. Romy saw her father's struggles, his attempts to juggle the demands of fame and family. At times, he seemed to be a victim of his own success, a man trapped by the expectations of the world. In moments when he was alone, she caught glimpses of his vulnerability, his weariness, and his isolation. It was a side of him that he rarely showed the world, but one that Romy came to understand all too well. Yet, no matter how much Rob tried to balance his professional life with his family life, the emotional distance between them remained. Romy's memories were filled with moments where the family seemed disconnected, the love buried beneath layers of expectation, pressure, and fear. Even when Rob would make an effort to connect with his children, it always felt like an attempt to repair something that had already been broken beyond repair. The story of Rob Reiner's family was not just about fame and success. It was about the emotional toll that fame can take on those closest to the person in the spotlight. For Romy, the price of being a child of a famous filmmaker was far higher than anyone could have imagined. The story of their family was a story of love, loss, and the deep psychological scars that come with growing up in a world that expects perfection. The tension between the public persona and private reality of the Reiner family became impossible to ignore as time wore on. For all of Rob Reiner's success, there was a dark undercurrent that ran through the family dynamic, a reality that Romy was forced to confront. Behind the glamorous red carpet photos and the heartwarming interviews, the cracks in the Reiner family foundation were beginning to show. The tipping point came with the tragic unfolding of events in the past few years. What seemed like a family on the brink of healing and reconciliation spiraled into a chaotic and heartbreaking set of circumstances. As the world watched Rob's career soar and his reputation as a beloved Hollywood figure remained intact, his personal life started unraveling in ways that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. Romy's own emotional turmoil was magnified by the strain of her father's absence. While he was busy chasing success, attending meetings, and worrying about scripts, box office numbers, and critical reviews, Romy was left behind to navigate the mess of her childhood memories and unresolved feelings. The dissonance between the Rob Reiner that the public adored and the father Romy knew at home was too much for her to reconcile. As a result, she began to withdraw into herself, battling the confusion and loneliness of trying to live up to an image that felt increasingly alien. During the time leading up to the family's eventual breakdown, Rob was faced with a deepening crisis. His relationship with his children became more strained as Romy and her brother increasingly realized the toll that their father's expectations had taken on them. But it wasn't just the weight of perfection that crushed them. It was the sense that nothing was ever enough. No matter how hard they tried to please him, they never felt fully seen, fully loved. It was as if their existence was only validated by their success and ability to meet Rob's impossible standards. The family, which had once been the epitome of Hollywood success, now became the site of explosive conflicts, painful silences, and unspoken grievances. Romy's brother, Nick, who had always been sensitive and thoughtful, found himself struggling in ways that were not visible to the public. He began to slip deeper into addiction, seeking solace in substances to numb the pain of constantly living under the pressure of his father's expectations. His battles with addiction became a quiet yet destructive force in the family, and it wasn't long before it became apparent that no one in the family knew how to deal with it. Romy found herself trapped in a cycle of frustration and helplessness. While her brother spiraled further into his struggle with addiction, Rob's attempts to intervene were hampered by his own emotional barriers. Rob, a man who had spent his entire life in the public eye, didn't know how to communicate with his children in a meaningful, supportive way. His way of showing love was often rooted in control and expectations rather than understanding and acceptance. As Nick's addiction worsened, Romy found herself in the role of the reluctant caretaker, trying to bridge the gap between her father's oblivion and her brother's suffering. She would often intervene in Nick's darkest moments, trying to keep him from falling too deep, but it wasn't enough. The pain of watching her brother's downward spiral was compounded by the realization that her father, despite his public image of warmth and compassion, was emotionally unavailable in their time of need. Rob's fame and ego seemed to overshadow the familial bond, and his focus on his own work and image made it impossible for him to truly see his children's pain. In the meantime, Romy was also dealing with her own struggles. She was a woman caught between the expectations of her father and her own desire to live a life that was authentic to her. She wrestled with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, believing that she was failing her father by not living up to his vision of who she should be. In her quiet moments, she would ask herself if she would ever be able to escape the shadow of her father's expectations. And yet, despite the turmoil, she still longed for some kind of reconciliation, a chance to understand her father, to see him as a person rather than a public figure. But as time went on, it became clear that no such reconciliation would come easily. The fractures within the Reiner family grew wider, and Rob's attempts to reconnect with his children were often met with resistance. It seemed as though the damage had already been done, and no amount of apologies or heartfelt gestures could undo the years of emotional neglect. The family's breakdown came to a head when Rob's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and the pressures of his career began to take an even greater toll on him. The man who had once seemed so in control of his life was now unraveling before his children's eyes. He began to drink more heavily, and his temper flared more often. Romy and Nick found themselves on the receiving end of his frustration, with Rob turning his anger inward and blaming his children for his own inability to manage the pressures of his life. One night, in the midst of a heated argument, Rob lost control completely. In a moment of anger, he physically lashed out at Nick, delivering a blow that would mark the point of no return for the family. Romy, who had witnessed countless arguments and emotional outbursts between her father and brother, was left in shock. This was a line that had never been crossed before. Rob had struck his own son, the child he claimed to love unconditionally. The aftermath of that moment was nothing short of devastating. The once tightly knit Reiner family was shattered, and the emotional toll on both children was immeasurable. Nick, already struggling with addiction, now found himself emotionally and physically scarred by the incident. Rob, meanwhile, retreated further into his work, unable to face the reality of what had happened. Romy, for the first time in her life, began to realize that the idealized version of her father, the one she had carried in her heart for so long, was nothing more than a facade. Behind the camera flashes and the accolades, Rob was just a man, flawed, broken, and struggling to come to terms with the very things he had spent his life hiding from. And while Romy continued to love him, the truth was clear. The damage had been done, and the family was forever changed. The picture-perfect family that the world had admired had crumbled under the weight of its own secrets. The aftermath of the events surrounding Rob Reiner's family was both profound and heart-wrenching. The emotional and psychological toll that the family endured in the wake of the breakdown was felt most acutely by his children. The damage had already been done, and it was clear that their once seemingly perfect family would never be the same again. Romy, who had spent so much of her life trying to reconcile the public image of her father with the man she knew in private, was now left grappling with the fallout of her family's collapse. The realization that her father, whom she had once idolized, was far from the hero she had imagined him to be, shattered her sense of security. For years, she had been forced to live up to an ideal that wasn't her own. Now, faced with the reality of her father's flaws, she had to learn how to rebuild her life and her identity. As for Rob, the fallout from the incident with Nick left him in a place of emotional devastation. Despite his long and successful career in Hollywood, he was unable to repair the emotional wounds he had inflicted on his family. The weight of his public success, coupled with the pressure of maintaining an image of perfection, had finally caught up with him. Rob's personal and professional life began to fray at the edges. His once seemingly invincible aura of control and confidence dissolved, replaced by a sense of impotence and self-doubt that he had never before acknowledged. In the wake of the breakdown, Rob retreated further into his work, using it as a means of escaping the discomfort of his personal life. He spent long hours on set, often working late into the night, trying to drown out the chaos that had invaded his home. His emotional distance only deepened the divide between him and his children. Romy, feeling neglected and abandoned, began to confront the reality of her father's emotional unavailability. It wasn't that Rob didn't care. It was that he didn't know how to show that care in a way that his children could understand. His love, if it could be called that, was conditional and rooted in a need for control. It was a love that placed the family's reputation and success above their emotional well-being. Nick, meanwhile, continued his battle with addiction. The incident with Rob had only deepened his sense of shame and guilt. He felt like he had failed his father, as if his addiction was a direct result of his inability to live up to the family's expectations. His struggles with substance abuse became more pronounced as he sought ways to numb the emotional pain that had plagued him for years. Yet, despite his growing isolation and despair, Nick still clung to the hope that he could find redemption. He attended rehab several times, but each time he found himself relapsing into the same destructive patterns. The cycle of addiction, guilt, and shame continued, and with each relapse, the gulf between Nick and his family widened. Romy watched her brother's slow decline with a heavy heart. She longed to help him, but she too was battling her own demons. The emotional scars left by her father's control and anger were deep, and she didn't know how to begin healing. Romy had spent so much of her life seeking her father's approval that she had forgotten how to live for herself. The question that haunted her was whether she could ever break free from the suffocating grip of her family's expectations. She wasn't just living under the shadow of Rob's fame. She was living under the weight of a love that was never truly unconditional. The relationship between Rob and Nick, once strong and filled with promise, was now a shadow of what had been. The emotional distance between them grew with each passing day, as Rob struggled to come to terms with the damage he had caused. He had always prided himself on being a strong, dependable figure, both professionally and personally. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he found himself questioning everything he had built. The legacy he had worked so hard to create now seemed like an illusion, a facade that hid the painful reality of his family's dysfunction. In the midst of this turmoil, the press and public continued to view Rob as the same beloved filmmaker they had always known. His films continued to inspire and captivate audiences, but the man behind the camera was a far cry from the image that the world adored. The family's personal struggles remained behind closed doors, hidden from the public eye. And yet, the silence within the Reiner household spoke volumes. Romy, while still deeply affected by the events that had unfolded, began to understand the true cost of fame. She realized that the picture-perfect family that had been presented to the world was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully crafted image designed to hide the cracks that had always existed. The pressure to maintain that image had driven her father, and in turn, his children, to the brink. And now, the consequences were undeniable. The emotional damage that had been inflicted over the years could not be undone by mere apologies or promises of change. The foundation of the Reiner family had been shaken to its core, and the aftermath was felt in every corner of their lives. As Rob continued to struggle with his inner turmoil, Romy and Nick were left to pick up the pieces of their own lives. The road to healing was long and uncertain, and they both knew that the scars left by their father's actions would never fully fade. But in the midst of the pain, there was a glimmer of hope. Romy began to realize that, while she might never be able to fully reconcile with her father, she could still find a way to live for herself. She could reclaim her own identity, free from the shadows of her father's expectations. For Nick, the road to recovery was still fraught with obstacles, but he had begun to understand that his struggles weren't a reflection of his worth. He had spent so many years believing that his value was tied to his father's approval that he had lost sight of who he truly was. Now, he was learning to define himself on his own terms, free from the suffocating grip of his family's legacy. In the end, the Reiner family was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been fractured by years of emotional neglect and unspoken pain. The cost of fame, of success, and of the relentless pursuit of perfection had taken its toll. But even in the face of tragedy, there was a sense of resilience. Rob, Romy, and Nick were all survivors, each struggling in their own way to navigate the aftermath of their past. The road to healing would not be easy, but it was a road they would have to walk, together or apart. As the years passed, the wounds that had been inflicted on Rob Reiner's family slowly began to fester beneath the surface. The perfect image of the Reiner family, the one so carefully curated for the public eye, remained intact. On the red carpets, they still appeared united, smiling, posing, sharing stories of their collective achievements. But behind the scenes, the cracks had only deepened, and the silence between them had become an unbearable weight. Romy, now an adult, found herself constantly reflecting on the complexities of her upbringing. She had spent so much of her life trying to live up to the expectations set by her father, trying to fit into a mold that had been created long before she could understand it. But in the years following the family's breakdown, Romy began to see her childhood through a new lens. The idyllic memories of family vacations, holiday dinners, and laughter-filled gatherings were overshadowed by the growing sense of suffocation she had experienced under her father's control. As a young girl, Romy had been taught that her worth was tied to her ability to perform, to be a reflection of the perfect Reiner family. Every success, every accolade, was a testament to the family name. But every failure, no matter how small, was magnified into something far greater, something that could tarnish the family's reputation. The pressure was immense. She often found herself wondering if her father truly saw her for who she was, or if she was just another character in the film he had written for her. In the years that followed the family's disintegration, Romy began to reconnect with the parts of herself that had been buried for so long. She took a step back from the life that had been dictated by her father's desires and started to carve out her own path. The road to self-discovery wasn't easy. The memories of her father's anger, of his controlling nature, still haunted her. But slowly, she learned to separate herself from the legacy of perfection that had been forced upon her. For Nick, the journey was even more difficult. His struggles with addiction had become more pronounced over the years, and the weight of his family's expectations had only made it harder to find peace. He had spent so much of his life feeling like a failure, believing that he could never live up to the image of the perfect son that his father wanted him to be. Each relapse was another reminder that he wasn't enough, that no matter how hard he tried, he could never escape the shadow of his father's dominance. But despite the constant battles with addiction and self-doubt, Nick began to see that his worth was not defined by his father's approval. It took years of therapy, self-reflection, and moments of painful growth, but eventually, Nick realized that he had value in his own right. His story was not one of failure, but of survival, surviving the crushing weight of his father's expectations, surviving the tumultuous journey of addiction, and, most importantly, surviving the loss of his own sense of self. For the first time in his life, Nick began to understand that he was worthy of love, not because of what he had achieved, but because he existed. It was during this period of self-reflection that Romy and Nick began to find common ground. Their relationship, strained for so long, began to heal. They both recognized the immense pain they had endured under their father's influence, and slowly, they started to rebuild their bond. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, old wounds that had never fully healed, but there was also a shared understanding that neither of them had asked for the lives they had been given. They had both been caught in the same web of expectations, guilt, and shame. In the midst of this healing process, Romy came to a sobering realization. The love her father had shown her, though distorted by control and manipulation, was real. It was just wrapped in a layer of fear and perfectionism. Rob Reiner was not a monster. He was a man who had been consumed by the very thing he had once loved: fame. The pressures of his career, the need to constantly maintain the image of success, had eroded his ability to connect with his children in a meaningful way. He had never learned how to show love in a way that wasn't tied to achievement. Romy's understanding of her father's flaws did not absolve him of his actions, but it allowed her to view him through a more compassionate lens. She began to see the man behind the public figure, the man who had struggled with his own demons, the man who had been hurt by the same pressures that had affected her. In this new light, Romy found herself able to forgive him, not because his actions were excusable, but because she had come to understand the complexities of his own pain. Yet, as much as she longed for a reconciliation, Romy also knew that some things could never be undone. The scars of her childhood, the constant feeling of inadequacy, the silent screams for help, would never fully fade. But through her own healing, she was able to let go of the anger and resentment that had held her captive for so long. She realized that forgiveness was not for her father. It was for herself. She needed to free herself from the chains of the past in order to move forward. Nick, too, began to find his own peace. He finally sought professional help for his addiction, and for the first time in years, he began to embrace the idea that he could be more than just the son of Rob Reiner. He could be his own person, separate from the expectations that had plagued him for so long. As he moved forward in his recovery, he started to find a new sense of purpose. His struggles had shaped him into someone stronger, someone who could face life on his own terms. Together, Romy and Nick began to build a new relationship, not one that was defined by their father's legacy, but one that was built on mutual understanding and respect. They shared their pain, their struggles, and their triumphs, supporting each other in ways that had never been possible before. They were no longer defined by the image of the perfect Reiner family. They were simply two siblings finding their way in the world. While Rob's story remained unfinished, the Reiner children began to rewrite their own. The scars of the past would always be a part of them, but they were no longer prisoners to the legacy that had once held them captive. They had finally broken free, and in doing so, they had begun the process of healing, not just as children of a famous man, but as individuals in their own right. The journey of healing for Rob Reiner's family was far from simple, but as time passed, Romy and Nick began to reflect on the deeper lessons they had learned. For years, they had been trapped in the emotional confines of their father's expectations, constantly striving for approval and perfection. But as they navigated the aftermath of their family's crisis, they came to understand that true healing wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing the complexities of their own emotions and experiences. Romy, in particular, began to see her life in a new light. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of her father's fame and success, believing that her worth was tied to his achievements. But as she stepped away from that life, she began to explore her own identity, free from the constraints of her father's expectations. The realization that her self-worth was not determined by her family name was a pivotal moment for her. She didn't need to be perfect or live up to her father's legacy to be valuable. In fact, it was through accepting her own imperfections that she began to find peace. But this journey of self-discovery didn't come without its challenges. Romy had spent so many years suppressing her true feelings, burying the pain of her childhood in an attempt to protect her father's image. Now, as she began to confront those emotions, she realized just how much she had sacrificed for the sake of maintaining the facade of a perfect family. The truth was, she had never fully allowed herself to feel the depth of her own grief, her own anger, or her own sense of betrayal. The scars left by her father's actions were not just emotional. They were deeply rooted in the way she viewed herself and her place in the world. As Romy worked through these emotions, she came to understand that the key to healing lay in embracing the full spectrum of her experiences, the good, the bad, and the painful. She could no longer deny the impact her father had on her life, but she also realized that she didn't have to let that define her. The power to reclaim her own narrative was in her hands. She didn't have to live in the shadow of her father's mistakes or the expectations of the world. She was allowed to be her own person, free to define her own path. Nick, too, embarked on a similar journey of self-discovery. His struggles with addiction had often been seen through the lens of his father's disappointment. But as he sought help and began to recover, he started to see his own worth beyond the confines of his family's legacy. For so long, he had believed that he was failing not just his father, but the world. The pressure to live up to the Reiner name had weighed heavily on him, and he had internalized the belief that his worth was tied to his ability to succeed in ways that would be visible to others. In his recovery, Nick began to understand that his value didn't come from external achievements or validation. It came from within. His struggles with addiction, while painful, had shaped him into someone resilient and capable of growth. He had been through dark times, but he was learning how to find his way back to the light. The realization that he was worthy of love and respect, even in his brokenness, was a profound turning point for him. Together, Romy and Nick began to find a sense of peace with their past. Their relationship, once strained by years of emotional distance, began to heal as they shared their experiences and supported each other in their journeys of self-discovery. They understood that they didn't need to be perfect and that it was okay to acknowledge the pain they had endured. In fact, it was through acknowledging that pain that they could truly begin to heal. Their relationship with their father remained complicated. Rob's emotional distance and control had left deep scars that would take time to heal, but Romy and Nick had come to terms with the fact that they couldn't change the past. They had learned to forgive, not for Rob's sake, but for their own. They no longer carried the burden of seeking his approval. Instead, they began to focus on their own healing and growth, understanding that their happiness didn't have to be tied to his approval or the image of the perfect family. As Romy and Nick continued to rebuild their lives, they also started to redefine what family meant to them. They had spent so much of their lives striving to meet the expectations of others, but now they were learning to create a new definition of family, one that was rooted in love, acceptance, and understanding. Their bond as siblings became stronger as they shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. They realized that family didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. The process of healing for Romy and Nick was not linear. There were days when the pain of the past felt overwhelming, when the memories of their father's control and anger resurfaced, and when they found themselves questioning whether they could ever fully move on. But with each step forward, they learned to embrace their vulnerability, to be kinder to themselves, and to recognize that healing was a lifelong process. In the end, the story of the Reiner family was not one of perfection, but of resilience. Rob's legacy, while complicated by the struggles of his family, was not the defining factor of Romy and Nick's lives. They had the power to rewrite their own stories, to reclaim their identities, and to heal from the emotional wounds of the past. They were no longer defined by their father's fame or their family's image. They were defined by their ability to love themselves and each other, flaws and all. Through their journey, Romy and Nick discovered that the true legacy they could carry forward was not the perfection that had been imposed upon them, but the strength they found in overcoming their pain and embracing the truth of who they were. And in that truth, they found the freedom to live their lives on their own terms. As the years continued to unfold, the Reiner family found themselves slowly but surely mending the fractured pieces of their past. Rob, Romy, and Nick each had their own journey to travel, but the road to healing, though long and difficult, was one that they walked together, albeit from different starting points. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but with time, each member of the family began to realize that the true measure of their worth did not lie in their ability to achieve perfection, but rather in their capacity to heal, grow, and love unconditionally. For Romy, the process of healing was one of redefining her own identity. For years, she had existed in the shadow of her father's legacy, trying to live up to the impossible standards he had set for her. But as she moved forward, Romy began to realize that she no longer needed to live for anyone but herself. Her father's love, as flawed as it had been, could no longer define her self-worth. She had spent far too many years measuring herself by the achievements she thought would earn his approval. Now, she understood that her true worth lay in the person she had become, the woman who could stand on her own, free from the expectations of others. In the quiet moments of reflection, Romy came to understand that forgiveness, both for her father and for herself, was the key to moving forward. It wasn't about absolving Rob of his mistakes, but about letting go of the anger that had bound her to the past. By forgiving, she was able to release the weight of the resentment that had held her captive for so long. And in doing so, she found the freedom to pursue her own happiness, to create her own path, and to heal the emotional wounds that had once felt insurmountable. Nick, too, began to find peace, though his journey was one that was fraught with more challenges. His struggles with addiction had been well documented, but behind those struggles was a deeper issue, a sense of inadequacy and a fear of disappointing his father. For years, he had believed that he was not good enough, that his worth was defined by his ability to succeed in ways that others could see. But in the process of recovery, Nick started to redefine his own sense of value. He realized that he didn't need to live up to anyone else's expectations. His worth was not contingent upon his ability to meet the standards set by his father or anyone else. It was inherent in who he was as a person, not as a reflection of the family name. Through therapy, self-reflection, and the love of those around him, Nick began to heal. He understood that his battles with addiction weren't a sign of weakness, but a part of his journey towards self-acceptance. He had spent so much of his life feeling lost, believing that he had to be perfect, that he had to live up to the image of a flawless son. But through his recovery, he learned to embrace his imperfections. He began to see that his struggles didn't define him. They were just part of his story, and that story was far from over. The relationship between Romy and Nick also grew stronger as they began to share their journeys with each other. They had both been deeply affected by their father's expectations, but they had also been scarred by the emotional distance he had maintained for much of their lives. As they navigated their own healing processes, they learned to support each other in ways that had once seemed impossible. They shared their pain, their progress, and their hopes for the future. In doing so, they began to heal the wounds of the past, and their bond as siblings grew deeper. As for Rob, his own healing process was slow and painful. The realization that his actions had caused irreparable harm to his children was a bitter pill to swallow. For so long, he had focused on his career, his image, and his legacy, believing that his success would make up for the emotional distance that existed within his family. But as he faced the consequences of his neglect, he came to understand that no amount of fame or success could replace the love and connection he had failed to give. In the quiet moments of introspection, Rob began to feel the weight of his mistakes. He recognized the pain he had caused his children, the pressure he had placed on them, and the emotional damage that had resulted from his attempts to control their lives. He could no longer deny the truth. He had let his need for perfection blind him to the emotional needs of his family. The man who had once been so confident, so certain of his ability to control everything, now found himself facing a reality that he had long ignored. But even in the face of this painful truth, Rob found a glimmer of hope. He began to reach out to his children, attempting to repair the relationship that had been broken. It was not easy. The wounds ran deep, and the years of emotional neglect could not be erased overnight. But Rob was willing to try. He understood now that the love he had for his children was not about shaping them into his ideal vision. It was about accepting them for who they were, imperfections and all. In the final moments of his journey, Rob's relationship with his children began to shift. While it was not a fairy tale reconciliation, it was a step toward healing. The damage that had been done could never be undone, but Rob began to realize that the most important thing he could do for his children was to be there for them, without judgment or expectation. He began to embrace the idea that love was not about control. It was about acceptance, forgiveness, and understanding. The story of Rob Reiner's family was one of pain, but it was also one of redemption. It was a story of brokenness, but also of healing. For Romy, Nick, and Rob, the road to recovery was long and fraught with obstacles. But through it all, they learned that healing came not from perfection, but from the willingness to face their past, to forgive, and to love unconditionally. The shadows of their past would always remain, but they had the power to define their future. And in that power, they found peace. As Romy and Nick looked back on the tumultuous years they had spent under their father's control, they realized that they had broken free from the chains of perfectionism. They had reclaimed their lives, their identities, and their ability to love and be loved. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that had ultimately brought them closer together. Not just as siblings, but as individuals who had overcome the wounds of their past and emerged stronger for it.